Welcome to Fact File. Today, we're diving into a mysterious crime that shook the quiet suburb of Oak Park, Illinois, back in 1980. Known for its ties to literature and architecture, Oak Park was a peaceful, middle-class area, but on its eastern border lay Austin, a neighborhood notorious for crime and social issues. In this unsettling environment, the lives of two young people, Karen and Phillips and Stephen Linscott, would intersect in a way no one could have predicted. Oak Park, Illinois in 1980, a nice, middle-class suburb with connections to Hemingway and Frank Lloyd Wright. A good place to live. But its eastern border, Austin Boulevard, was shared with the Austin neighborhood of Chicago's West Side, more known for crime, gangs, drugs, and poverty. Into this uneasy milieu came two young people whose lives would be entwined in a crime that reached more than a decade into the future. Karen Ann Phillips was born April 29, 1956 in Forest City, North Carolina. She transferred colleges as a junior to Aurora College in Aurora, Illinois, some 40 miles west of Chicago. After graduation, she enrolled in nursing school at Presbyterian St. Luke's Medical Center in the South Loop area of Chicago, and in April 1979 rented a studio apartment at 324 North Austin Boulevard in Oak Park, only 20 minutes away. Karen appears to have been a friendly person and perhaps naive. According to the book Innocence, the true story of Steve Linscott, she made friends readily and was not afraid to visit others' apartments in the building on short acquaintance, nor to allow them into hers. In one instance, she had allowed a stranger off the street into her apartment to paint her portrait. In her off time, Karen was a practitioner of Kriya Yoga and was heavily involved with the Temple of Kriya Yoga in Chicago. She became close to Helen, a Swami at the temple who encouraged her to study to become a Swami herself. But all was not positive. One of her North Carolina friends, when visiting, became concerned about the temple's influence on Karen and tried to warn her. This friend saw some of the temple members as drug addicts, disagreed with some of the teachings, and disliked how much money Karen was pouring into it, money she could not afford. He talked to Karen, but Karen largely disagreed and ignored his advice to leave the temple. 2 doors down from Karen's apartment, at 316 North Austin Boulevard, was the Good News Mission, a Christian-sponsored halfway house for ex-inmates. Stephen Linscott, a 26-year-old Bible student, lived there with his wife as house parents and counselor in exchange for free rent. Stephen came from Maine and had 2 years in college studying psychology before following in his father's footsteps as a radio man in the Navy. Stephen had had a religious conversion in 1974 and wanted to study at Bible College to expand his understanding of Bible teaching. After his honorable discharge in 1979, Stephen, his wife Lois, and their 2 small children moved to Chicago so Stephen could study at Emmaus Bible College in Oak Park. Around the beginning of September 1980, the family moved into the Good News Mission. Stephen counseled the residents and attended classes, while Lois cared for their young children. Stephen was aware of and bothered by the atmosphere of crime and violence in the neighborhood, but happy with the work he was doing at the mission. On the night of October 3rd, the Linscotts were at home. Lois went to bed at about 10:30, Stephen shortly after. In the early hours of October 4th, Stephen woke from a disturbing dream where he saw a man in a living room talking with another person. Stephen was bothered by the vividness of the dream and tried to dismiss it. Once awake, he heard a noise in the flat and went to investigate, but saw nothing. He went back to bed, and his dream resumed. The atmosphere in the dream living room had turned sinister. The man smiled evilly, lifted his arms, and started beating the other person on the head with a metal object. The second person was forced down onto their hands and knees, then to the floor. There was blood everywhere. Stephen awoke again. In his mind, the dream was linked to his situation of living with criminals and seeing evidence of crime in his neighborhood. Later that day, police knocked on the door of the halfway house. They were speaking to all the neighbors. A murder had occurred overnight just a couple of doors down. Police were seeking any information and asked everyone to contact them if they remembered anything. Even if it seems silly, on October 3rd, Karen Phillips had gone to class and got a ride home with a classmate. Later, she attended class at the Kriya Temple, getting home about 10:30 p.m. On arriving home, she got a call from her friend Helen, and they arranged to meet up the next day at 11 to go to a flea market. The next day, Karen failed to meet up with Helen as planned, and Helen wasn't able to contact her by phone. Helen got her husband to go to the apartment to check on Karen, but there was no answer. He knocked on the next door apartment, where the neighbor, Mohammed, said he had heard raised voices and pounding noises in Karen's apartment after midnight, and had knocked on the door to ask them to quiet down. The noises stopped, then resumed for a short while. Peter, a neighbor from upstairs, soon joined the group, and eventually Helen's husband decided it was time to call the fire department for help. The responders discovered Karen dead, face down on the floor of her studio apartment. Her body was naked, with her nightgown rucked up around her neck. She had been beaten and had numerous bruises and abrasions. On autopsy, she was discovered to have been raped, while the cause of death was beating and strangulation. Foreign hairs were found in her hands, pubic area, and on the carpet surrounding where she lay. Swabs and other physical evidence were taken for examination, but this was in the days before DNA analysis. Only microscopic and serum analysis were available. A tire iron covered with blood and hair was found in bushes outside the building, later identified as the murder weapon. Hearing the news, Stephen remembered his dream, but he hesitated about whether to tell the police about it. He consulted a coworker on Sunday and his wife on Monday after reading a newspaper account of the killing. Both felt he should contact the police. It couldn't hurt and might help, so Stephen called the Oak Park police around 9:30 p.m. on Monday, October 6th, and told them that he had a dream about a man beating someone to death the night Karen had been murdered. He described a man in his 20s with short blonde hair who beat another person, possibly black, with a metal object. Police asked him to write it all down, and they would come to his house to pick it up. After the discussion with his wife on Monday, defendant telephoned the Oak Park police and said that he had dreamed about a murder on the same night as the murder that had been reported. Defendant was told to write an account of his dream and that the police would contact him later. That evening, 2 police officers went to defendant's residence. They read defendant's account of the dream, and one of the police officers asked defendant why he had not described the murder weapon. According to the police officer, defendant had stated in the unrecorded telephone conversation that evening that defendant thought the murder weapon was a blunt object that looked like a tire iron. Defendant denied that he referred to the murder weapon as a tire iron, and he told the police officer that he had not described the weapon as a tire iron in his written account because he was uncertain what the object was in his dream. Defendant told the officers that in his dream a man bludgeoned a woman to death. The man in the dream was approximately 20 to 30 years old, had straight blonde hair, was light complected, had a somewhat husky build, and was approximately 5 feet 5 inches to 5 feet 7 inches tall. He was wearing brown trousers and a terry cloth shirt with 2 or 3 stripes across the chest. In the first stage of the dream, the attacker was quiet and easygoing, but defendant noticed a change come over the person. Defendant then awakened, tried to shake off the dream, and fell back asleep. His dream continued with the man striking the woman on the head while she was lying or crouching on the floor. The victim had an air of acceptance even though she did not expect the attack, and she did not offer much resistance. As you would expect, the dream had the police interested. It has to be a very unusual occurrence that a member of the public comes forward with a dream that correlates in both timing and details to an actual crime. Police asked Stephen to come in to discuss the dream on October 8th. It had not escaped them that Stephen himself resembled the dream attacker in some respects, having straight light hair, a square build, and being between 20 and 30. When Stephen came for the interview, they noted that he was wearing a short-sleeved terry shirt with some stripes, similar to what he described of the dream attacker. In the conference room, defendant stated that on October 4th, between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m., he had a vivid dream. The dream was about a ruthless beating. He said the attacker wore a white or off-white terry cloth shirt with 2 red or purple stripes on the chest and 1 on the sleeve. He thought that the victim knew her assailant because they were at ease with one another. In response to a question, defendant said that he thought the victim was a religious person. When asked about her background, defendant said that she was somewhat intelligent, at least high school and beyond a little bit. Defendant had the impression that the beating occurred close by in a living room which was the same size or larger than his 4-room apartment. He said the living room contained a couch and stereo. Defendant said that in his dream, the victim and the attacker talked for a while. Defendant did not know how long they talked or what was said. After a time, the attacker produced a dark, metallic instrument and began striking the woman in the face. The instrument was tapered down at one end and rounded at the other. Defendant was unsure what the instrument was, but he described it as a counterbalance like a clock. The transcript of the questions at this session show the lines of inquiry the police were taking. They veered into off-topic discussions, religion, and asked Stephen to extrapolate rather widely about aspects of the dream, presumably in hopes of getting incriminating statements. They tried to get him to say what the killer might have been thinking and what he would do next. All this time, the officers portrayed the sessions as informational, trying to use Stephen's knowledge and background in psychology to help with the case. Police again requested Stephen's presence on October 10th. They started the interview by reading Stephen his rights. They went over the same ground as previous interrogations. At one point, the assistant district attorney joined the session. Stephen, becoming wary, asked if they considered him a suspect, but they reassured him that he was just their prime witness. After several hours of questioning, Stephen agreed to go to a hospital for swabs and blood to be taken for comparison with evidence from the scene. Again, they told him that this was so he would be absolutely eliminated as a potential suspect, so as not to taint his evidence in front of a jury. In reality, police had locked in on Stephen as a likely guilty party from the beginning. After returning from the hospital, Stephen asked to call his wife. Unbeknown to Stephen, during this time an assistant DA and policemen were questioning Lois at the mission. They looked around the apartment and looked at the soles of Stephen's shoes. A worried Lois had contacted the head of the Good News mission, who advised that Stephen should leave immediately and not say anything more. But when Stephen stood up and said he was leaving, the atmosphere changed. Police told him he was going nowhere, that they knew he had killed Karen, that the evidence he had given would send him to the electric chair. But Stephen refused to confess after an additional 2 hours, and without physical evidence, police were forced to let him leave. It was by then 3 a.m. By November 19th, the crime lab had provided the results of tests on the specimens found at the crime scene. On November 24th, Stephen was pulled over while driving and arrested for the rape and murder of Karen and Phillips on October 4th. He was detained without bond at Cook County Jail, waiting for trial. Bond was later set at $450,000, and Stephen's supporters were able to raise the amount for him to be released on bond. The trial finally began on June 1, 1982. The prosecuting attorneys leaned heavily on the dream and correlating it to the facts of the murder. The dream, tape from Stephen's first taped interview on October 8th, was played in court. They said that the dream included details of the crime that only the perpetrator would know. The taped statements, with their descriptions and thoughts about the perpetrator's state of mind, amounted to a confession. They zeroed in on the following points of comparison. Killer with short blonde hair, age between 20 and 30, wearing a short-sleeved terry shirt with stripes, attacking with a blunt metal object like a tire iron, 7 blows around the head and shoulders, and the victim not resisting. The attack taking place in a large living room with a couch and stereo. They ignored that Stephen's dream killer was 5'6" -5'7" and husky, whereas Stephen was 6 and slim with glasses, that Stephen described a metal weight about 9 inches long, where the actual weapon was 2 feet long, that there were more than 7 blows in the actual attack. that the scene of the crime was a 10 by 12-foot area of a studio apartment, with no couch. In terms of the physical evidence, they had the hair, blood, and swabs. A key point was that the vaginal fluid did not indicate the blood type of the attacker, meaning he was a non-secretor. 15 to 20% of males are non-secretors, and Stephen Linscott was in this group. A new set of tests showed the mixed vaginal fluids contained type ABOO and PGM 2:1, Karen's blood type. Police interpreted this as proof that a non-secretor had been the killer, but it could also have been a secretor with the same blood type. This greatly expands the pool of possibles. Testimony about the hair samples stated that the hairs were consistent with Stephen's. Closing arguments made it more emphatic that the hairs were Stephen's. Again, recall that this is in the days before DNA. The dream and the lab tests formed basically the whole prosecution case. Testimony for the prosecution included statements from police going back to early interviews. Sergeant Mendrick recounted a conversation with Stephen on November 25th, after his arrest. Mendrick asked Stephen if the dream was so vivid, was it possible he thought he was dreaming when he was actually doing it? Stephen said no, because he checked out his subconscious that morning while praying as to whether he did it, and also checked his arm, since the murderer's arm would have been sore after swinging a heavy object with such violence. Mendrick said Stephen's hair had been found in the apartment. Stephen said if that was so, Satan must have put them there to prevent him from continuing his work in ministry. Stephen's attorney stayed away from the dream for the most part, instead focusing on Stephen's unblemished record prior to this event and the unreliability of the physical evidence. As a Navy radioman, Stephen had passed security checks to obtain a top security clearance. His only prior brush with the law was a $50 ticket in Maine. He was well regarded in the community and had the backing of his employers and the college he attended. Regarding the seminal tests, he pointed out that 15 to 20% is a large number and that possibly jury members also fell into this group. He disregarded the hair analysis as not being considered a reliable source, let alone dispositive. There was testimony about the position of Karen's hands after the murder. Her thumbs were pressed against her index fingers in an O shape. Helen Palella stated that this was a sign in their religion of seeking for peace, which she interpreted as an acceptance of death. There was a side table set up as an altar in the room where Karen was found. The defense attorney decried attempts to suggest a religious motive and portrayal of Stephen as a member of a kooky religion. On June 16, 1982, after 9.5 hours of deliberation over 2 days, the jury returned a verdict finding Stephen Linscott guilty of the murder of Karen Linscott. They found him not guilty of rape. He was taken into custody with sentencing set for July 21st. The courtroom erupted with shouts from Stephen's supporters at the Bible College. One of the board members said, "The verdict results from the meeting of the naivete of Steve and of the jury believing this concocted story. To us, it is a miscarriage of justice." Notably, an alternate juror reported statements made by other jurors that revealed they had discussed the case with outsiders, made up their minds immediately, and brought newspaper clippings into the jury room. She did not report it at the time because she did not know she could approach the judge. In November, the judge denied a request for a hearing into the allegations. On November 23rd, Judge Adam Stillo sentenced Stephen to 40 years in prison for the murder of Karen and Phillips. Stephen was sent to the Centralia Correctional Center in Centralia, Illinois, a small town about 3 hours south of Chicago. Lois moved there with the children, taking a job as a nurse to support the family. On December 3rd, the defense team filed an appeal on the basis of insufficient evidence, destruction of critical evidence without notifying the defense, and misrepresentation of test results. The destruction of evidence refers to sending the last swab sample to Scotland Yard for more sophisticated blood typing, after which no samples remained for testing. This was first revealed by the prosecution at the trial. The appellate brief was filed June 9, 1983, and oral arguments took place on December 21, 1983. The law moved slowly, and the appeal was decided in August 1985. In a 2-1 decision, the appellate court reversed the conviction on the basis that the dream was not a confession and should not have been entered as evidence. Further, that the circumstantial evidence was not conclusive. The opinion put that Stephen's dream did not reveal information that only the killer could have known. By the time Stephen contacted police, some of the details of the crime were already published and he might have known them from those sources. They also pointed out that there were inconsistencies between the dream details and the actual event. The court said the forensic results only showed that the samples could have been from Stephen. No positive identification was made. Finally, the court instanced that no fingerprints or direct evidence of Stephen's presence in the apartment were ever presented. People v. Linscott, 135 ILAP, 3D 773, 779, ILAP, CT 1985. Under the circumstances, we believe that as a matter of law, the state did not meet its responsibility to present direct or circumstantial evidence which proves that defendant is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. While it was the province of the jury to weigh the evidence and determine the credibility of witnesses, a reviewing court will not hesitate to reverse a conviction which, as in this case, rests solely upon circumstantial evidence that merely raises a possibility or suspicion that defendant is guilty. If we did not reverse such a conviction, we would indeed be derelict in our duty as a reviewing court. Accordingly, the judgment of conviction is reversed. The state countered with a petition to appeal the reversal to the Illinois Supreme Court. So Stephen was not released from Centralia Correctional Center until he was unexpectedly granted bond on October 31st. On October 17, 1986, the Illinois Supreme Court upheld the original conviction by a 4-2 decision, reversing the earlier decision by the appellate court. The Supreme Court stated that the evidence presented by the prosecution was sufficient for a jury to find Linscott guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. In particular, defendant's account of the beating, his knowledge of the murder weapon, and his knowledge of the victim's passive acceptance of the attack showed knowledge of the crime which would not likely be available to anyone other than the murderer, the court said. Nightmare goes on for Dream Killer, Tom Gibbons, Chicago Sun-Times, November 9, 1986. They remanded the case back to the lower court for decisions regarding some of the forensic evidence. On July 29, 1987, the appellate court again reversed the conviction and ordered a new trial based on prosecutorial misconduct. Dissimilarities between the dream and the murder were overlooked, and test results on physical evidence misstated that the blood and hairs were identified as Stephen's, rather than that they could not be ruled out as Stephen's. The result was that Stephen did not have a fair trial. Once again, the Cook County State's Attorney appealed to the Supreme Court. New evidence was presented in 1988 when the Deputy Chief Medical Examiner in the original trial, having read the book's Innocence by a Linscott supporter, re-examined some of the abrasions in photographs of the body, and believed they were actually bite marks. Two experts from Northwestern University presented preliminary evidence that the marks could not have come from Stephen. However, a Cook County judge ruled the evidence inconclusive, and it had no effect on the appeals. The arguments before the Supreme Court took place November 14th and 15th, 1990. Finally, on January 31, 1991, the Illinois Supreme Court vacated the conviction and sent the case back to the Cook County State's Attorney for a new trial. The court held that the prosecution made prejudicial statements identifying hairs found at the scene as belonging to Stephen, and told the jury that blood typing showed the semen at the crime came from someone with Stephen's blood type. Neither statement was accurate. Adriana Colindres, retrial ordered in 80 Murder, Chicago Tribune, February 1, 1991. Although a new trial was slated for July 1992, it never took place. Then State's Attorney Jack O'Malley sent the old DNA samples to a lab in Boston with the most up-to-date facilities for DNA testing, and the results came back inconclusive. We do not have a 100% yes or no answer. I cannot tell you whether he is innocent or guilty. We frankly do not have enough evidence to obtain a conviction. Jack O'Malley quoted in Associated Press, July 16, 1992. The Chicago Tribune quoted him, The scientific evidence does not completely exonerate the man, but it raises sufficient doubts and leaves us, in my opinion, with no choice but to drop the prosecution of him. Andrew Fiegelman, Chicago Tribune, July 16, 1992. In 2002, Governor George Ryan issued a pardon, ending the case for good. So a 12-year ordeal was over for Stephen Linscott and his family. Today, he is a practicing psychotherapist and also has a master's degree in social work. Stephen wrote a book about the trials called Maximum Security. Stephen Linscott, Randall Frame, Crossway Books, January 1, 1994. For those who are interested in more detail about what he experienced. The book Innocence, the true story of Steve Linscott by Steve's friend W. Gordon Hairsign, Zondervan Books, 1986, also covers the crime, the trials, and the intervening years. It has to be said that the Linscott family experienced an amazing amount of support from those within their community throughout these years. But what of Karen and Phillips? There is little to no newspaper coverage about her once the police mounted their case against Linscott. In the early days, they did obtain fingerprints from the scene, from the next-door neighbor, from the landlord, and from a TV repairman who had been given a key to Karen's apartment that week. They checked the alibis of these persons as well as Karen's friend Jerry from North Carolina. There was a man being investigated for rape in the far west suburbs who was living in Oak Park at the time of the murder. He was eliminated based on results of tests of body fluids. Beyond that, no information is available about any lines of investigation. No lab tests were done on the other men in Karen's circle. To all outward appearances, once Stephen came to them with the dream, police decided they had their man. When Stephen was arrested, the case was closed. Now, after all this time, the trail is more than cold. There may not even be viable samples for further testing. Once again, we are left to hope that a random genealogy search will turn up familial DNA. It's both tragic and frustrating. There are plenty of possibilities for who could have committed the crime. Karen lived on the fringes of a big city and traveled through the city for work and for leisure. She was a nursing student in a large teaching hospital where she would have known and come into contact with many people. She spent a large part of her time at the Temple Kriya, and the friend who knew her the longest was concerned about some of the people who hung around there. She lived in an area where crime and violence were regular occurrences. She was not as street smart as perhaps she should have been. She had a first-floor apartment with front and back doors. Although police found the back door padlocked, my best guess is that Karen let in someone she knew. There was no forced entry. She got home from the temple at about 10:30 and had a call from her friend Helen. There is nothing to say that she didn't bring someone home with her. Recall that the neighbor in the apartment next to hers heard voices and pounding after midnight. He had an impression of arguing. It could equally be someone she knew in the building. Reportedly, she was friends with a newish tenant above her. Something went wrong, perhaps to do with sex or drugs or money, and whoever it was attacked her. The biggest argument against this is the tire iron as a weapon. Who brings a tire iron to a friendly visit? That weapon suggests a random person who followed her home or was watching her, even an opportunistic break-in. But again, how did they get into the apartment unless she forgot to lock up? And then we have the dream. What do we make of it? It does seem that Stephen Linscott did not commit the murder. DNA was the final piece. Yet it is so strange that he had the dream on this particular night. The policeman who asked if he might have thought he was dreaming while actually committing the crime was not so far off base in terms of a theory, even if it proved wrong in this case. Stephen suggested that it might have been dream telepathy, which was allegedly one of the subjects Karen studied at the temple. Or it might have been a violent dream because he lived in a place where there was fighting on the street, frequent police sirens, and the like. It's possible that he had a vague dream of being attacked, and when he heard about the murder, his subconscious embroidered his memory with details. I lean toward this explanation, as my mind balks at any psychic theory. But I don't know. This truly is a remarkable case, a dream that became a nightmare. If you have come this far, thanks for watching. There were so many twists and turns that I needed a long video to do the case justice.